needed to consider everything in arbitration, not just be stuck to considering last best offers. And
Do you understand that concept?
Yeah, let me walk through it. I can explain it too. Where it really hit and really hit home this year was in Hartford. Hartford went through this long negotiating process prior to Mayor Bronin with, like, was it the firefighters? I can't even remember if it was firefighters, police officers, who it was, but it really doesn't matter. Well, they got to the end where Mayor Segarra finally came in with the last best offer, which was probably too high. We could all make that argument, but came in with the last best offer of 5%. I'm not going any higher than 5%. And the union came back and said 7.5%. And they couldn't come to an agreement, and so it goes to arbitrations. By the time it hits arbitration in the arbitration panel, Hartford is essentially, if they don't get the money they need, Hartford's going into bankruptcy. Hartford's problems have been well documented, so everybody knows what Hartford's fiscal situation is. Arbitrator came in during all this and essentially split the baby between the 5 and the 7.5, and in the edge of going into bankruptcy, awarded these people 6.5% raises, and folks just went nuts about it. Looking, I said, what is going on? The town's going, the city's ready to go into bankruptcy, and they just gave them a 6.5% raise. And so one of the things that it highlighted was the fact that arbitrators have to look at the last best offer is where they start. That's where they go from. And so we had pushed for this legislation saying that arbitrators should be able to look at everything. By the time it gets to them, they should be able to look at all of the fiscal situation of the community and not take everything into account, not be restricted by the last thing that somebody negotiated. And that was in the budget that passed that was vetoed. And then when that language got put into the agreed to bill, it's still in there in the agreed to bill, but now it only applies under that municipal review board. It only applies to communities that are in tier 4. So it essentially, you've created a state policy for sound fiscal management that only applies to 2 or 3 communities who are in the worst fiscally managed state that you could be in. And everybody else it doesn't apply to. I thought that was, good fiscal management policy for arbitration should not only kick in once a town is teetering on bankruptcy or is completely insolvent.
It sort of rubs both ways, as Joe's saying, is that the reforms finally got out there and got put into legislation for the first time we couldn't even get public hearings. Labor had captured so much of what was going on. But ultimately, as part of the budget negotiation, they had to sort of carve things down, and the legislation that got passed, both on the last best offer aspect and the fund balance, falls short of what really needs to be done. But at least in part, we have legislation on the books that was never going to even get close to being on the books, and if we can advance it forward, going forward, and get it expanded, we have a placeholder.
I will tell you, it's a glass half full or half empty concept. There are a lot of people who've been around this organization, the CCM, for years, or municipal government, or even the outside consultants that we use, and people under the Capitol Dome. When they talk about taking a victory tour, they say, you guys finally got these conversations to take place, and you finally got something done. This is great. There's been movement. We've finally engaged these things that were never be willing to be engaged before. I'm kind of the negative Nelly out of the group who looks at it and says, but it's nowhere near what it needed to be. You know what I mean? I don't know that it's so much a victory as others claim it to be, because we got the camel's nose under the tent when the state is in such dire straits that, to me it was almost like we created so much dialogue on it that the General Assembly knew that they had to do something because they couldn't take the criticism for doing nothing. But they did the least amount possible, to the point to where they almost did nothing to show that they were taking it seriously and did something. So it really just depends on how you look at it. But the other thing that kind of underscores all of this was the fact that we pushed so heavily for reforms in all these areas. And one of the reforms that we were pushing very heavily on is pension reform, and actually understanding the long-term viabilities of these pension systems and how they're impacting the state. And not from a perspective, like, you could find other think tank groups and that out there, they're far more conservative. that want to come in and just slash benefits and all of that. And that was not what we were doing. We were saying we need to take these pensions seriously. We need to understand their sustainability. We need to reform them where it's necessary before we get to the point that people hit retirement and there's just no money there to pay them what they believe that they're due or what they were promised. And one of the people who probably got that, the seriousness of the situation more than anybody else, was Governor Malloy. Governor Malloy, when you talk to him, you talk to other legislators, it was kind of like, it's affecting my budget now, but I don't have anybody in my community who's supposed to collect a pension who's not getting a check, so I'm not feeling that much pressure about it. Where Governor Malloy's looking at it and he's seeing the train wreck on the horizon. So that's good. But then his proposal, which he started getting session, particularly with teachers' retirement, was, well, let's just, because the state can no longer afford to pay this, let's shift a portion of it off onto cities and towns and make them pay for it. And we pushed back like crazy on that. And we didn't push back, I think some communities and maybe even some other municipal organizations push back from a standpoint saying, it's your problem, it's your mess, it's not ours, we're not paying for it, we're gonna defeat this. We never really took that approach. Our approach was, we understand we're all in this together. We understand that the teachers' retirement system, we see it like the governor does. It's heading towards a major disaster, and we recognize that. But before we start figuring out how to just rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic, we actually have to look at this system and reform the system and make sure that it's sustainable. And simply taking the cost and shifting it into the property tax, which is really what you're doing. You're shifting the cost from the income tax to the property tax. I mean, call the policy anything you want to call it. That's what it is. It's an income tax shift to a property tax shift. Simply shifting into the property tax, we thought, was a recipe for disaster from an economic development standpoint. And what it would do is put more strain on the property tax, and we're trying to find ways to even that out and put less strain. But the other thing that was frustrating is the governor would call that reforming the system, and our argument was, Governor, you're not reforming the system, you're just finding a new way to pay for a broken system. We believe not only is it the wrong way to pay for it, but you're also, even if there were an argument to be made to put it in the property tax, you still have to reform the system. So this fight went on the entire legislative session. What the General Assembly ultimately decided to do was, they didn't reform it at all. They really didn't address it at all. They increased the teacher's contribution into the system by 1%, but they reduced the state's contribution by that same amount. So it wasn't like they increased the overall contribution into the fund to help it. And then they put together a study to study the sustainability of the teacher's retirement system. A very, very important study, but my reading of the language is the study has more to do with putting political people on it than it does putting financial actuaries and people like that on it that really need to do the work. And then they're talking about having recommendations back to the 2018 General Assembly. If you could make an argument that this study could be done in that amount of time, which maybe it can, there should be a sense of urgency to at least naming the people to the study panel and getting it going. And to this point in time, there's not even been any discussions of when it's going to kick in and who's going to be on there or anything else. So
the issue of pension liability is huge at the state now, and I think there's an increasing public recognition of that, and the notion of the teachers' pension fund and the potential for it to explode local budgets is now emerged. And our organization traditionally was, one of the issues very involved was adequacy of education funding and the cost of public schools. And I would just put out there that, the 800-pound gorilla that's now sitting front and center, both for state and local governments, is this notion of pension liability and unfunded liabilities and where that's going to go in the next generation. That it's a huge issue, and it's always sort of been in the shadows, but I think it's out of the shadows and into the light a little bit more, that if it's not dealt with, it's going to unwind state and local budgets to some extent.
yeah, I think that's absolutely